We are now live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our workshop today, where the results of our recent Gender Diversity in Fibre survey will be presented. My name is Sue Waglianoni. My day job is Senior Director of International Marketing at CommScope, but I've had the pleasure of being a board member of the FTTH Council Europe now for the past 18 months. For those that may not be familiar with the Council, we've been in existence as an organisation for over 17 years, with a mission to advance ubiquitous full fibre-based connectivity across Europe. We're very proud of our membership of over 150 companies who benefit from the content that we produce as an organisation, some of the networking opportunities we create, and the relationships we have with policymakers and regulators. Next slide, please. Now, part of the content that I referenced just then is a busy series of webinars, this being one of those. They address topics core to the industry. Our next session will be at the end of January, hosted by Scient, who will be presenting a telco's perspective to planning and designing an integrated FTTH network. So one not to miss, so do look out for the invite and register your place to attend that session. Next slide, please. Before I get started, we have some basic housekeeping notes here to advise you that you will be able to, of course, access the replay, as well as all of the great material that will be presented here today once the webinar has concluded. We'd also love to share details of future webinars with you when they're being hosted. And of course, you can opt out of those if you no longer want to receive those. And finally, we know that this is a topic that sometimes divides opinions. So we say, don't be shy. Feel free to ask any questions you may have, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end to work our way through those. Next slide. Let's get on to it, shall we? So the survey itself was undertaken by the Women in Fibre Committee with the support of the FTTH Council Europe in September this year. We're a very young committee, and what we felt was important to do was to qualify the baseline on gender diversity within the industry that would enable us to be able to identify best practices and also areas where we felt there would need to be improvements. 280 respondents gave us their feedback on whether gender is a barrier to progression in the fibre industry, diversion and inclusion initiatives and their impact on organisations, the impact of COVID on work life, and if flexible working practices have helped them balance work and life effectively. I now have the honour to introduce Women in Fibre Committee member Roshene McCool. Roshene is a Senior Market and Technology Development Manager at Corning Optical Communications, and Rosh has been our driving force behind the survey analysis and will now be presenting our full findings. So Rosh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue. Hello, my name is Roshene McCool. As Sue said, I work for Corning Optical Communications as a Senior Market and Technology Development Manager. But today, I'm here to talk about the Women in Fibre Gender Diversity Survey. Before I start, I'd like to just give some recognition to a number of people who had a material impact on our ability to deliver this today. The first, of course, is Sue Guaglianone, who works for CommScope, who you've just heard from. She's been a driving force in the Women in Fibre Committee for the Fibre to the Home Council Europe. And it's her energy that has pushed some of these initiatives forward. So thank you to her. Also to Patricia Rodriguez, who is Head of Marketing at Outvise, and Sarah Grange, who is Head of Delivery at VX Fibre. They also collaborated with me on this survey. I'd like to add my personal thanks to Ty Gleddard and Marion Edwards at Corning Optical Communications, who've given me the space and empowered me to pursue some of my interests in this area, and that's allowed me to give my energy to this survey as it was needed. So let's start and look at what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about the survey itself and provide just a brief executive summary of what the findings were. And then I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into the data, into the questions and the conclusions. We're going to look at whether the fibre industry is a good place to work, whether gender is a barrier to progression in our industry, are diversity and inclusion initiatives working, have COVID-19 work practices been an improvement in work life, and is there sufficient flexibility in work practices to maintain a work-life balance? And then finally, look at the recommendations for the survey. So I'm going to start with the survey. We're going to look at, what were the genders of the respondents, what were the ages, the tenures in the industry and the seniority. And then I'm going to go through some of our, upfront conclusions, both the good news and the not so good news. We put the survey out and we received 280 responses from individuals across EMEA. The gender mix of those respondents was pretty much 50-50. Now, for those of us who've worked in the industry for a while, we know that our industry isn't 50-50. GSM did a survey in 2015 and found that about 20% of the industry was female. I anticipate that has improved over the 6 years since that survey, but I don't think we're at 50-50. What that means is that women were more motivated than men to fill in the survey, and we've taken special care when we've analysed the data to take into consideration that 50-50 gender mix doesn't necessarily reflect the gender mix in the industry as a whole. We had a 50-50 tenure mix. That is to say that about half of the respondents had less than 10 years time served in the industry, and about half more than 10 years time served in the industry. There were proportionally more women in this respondent mix that had a shorter tenure than there were that had a longer tenure. And in terms of age, the mix of respondents was dominated by the age group 25 to 56 years old. Now, of course, that's not surprising. That is the working age life, if you like. We had about 14% who were older than that 56 years, so in that baby boomer generation, and very few amongst the next generation that's coming through, which would be the Zoomers or Gen Z. We also looked at seniority of the respondents, and the way we defined seniority is shown here on the left-hand side of this graphic. So we defined seniority in 6 levels, from level 1 being entry level to level 6 being a business executive. And we accounted for both managerial seniority but also expertise seniority. As a technical industry, we know that there are many individuals at very senior levels that may not have business responsibility but do have responsibility in a specific area of expertise. And we had a pretty good spread across the respondents of seniority. Obviously at the lower levels, level 1 and 2, that was a higher proportion of the group compared to the very senior levels. But that is what we would expect, given that these seniority levels go in a kind of pyramid, right? So let's see what the survey said. Well, there was a lot of good news for the industry in this survey. Most respondents would recommend a career in the fibre industry. Most said they could be authentic to themselves in the workplace. Most think that everybody has the same opportunity to progress in their organisation. Most respondents work in organisations with diversity and inclusion initiatives and are able to use diversity policies to report issues related to gender. And most respondents agreed that work practices during the COVID-19 pandemic had improved their work lives. This is all good news. I want us to take away these good news stories from this survey because I think it's important to know that our industry is a place that people want to work. But it's important also to say that not all experiences are uniform. And the survey brings out, with the data, some real characteristics that have a material impact on women in our industry. So the survey results show, and this is the data that shows, that gender is a barrier to progression. And what I mean by that is that if I look at the respondent set, I can predict if somebody is at higher levels of seniority in our industry by their gender. And that shows gender bias. That effect materialises later in a woman's career. So it's not obvious right at the beginning, but later on, we start to see the impact. And when we dug into that a little bit more, what we saw was that most men see no barriers to progression, whereas women see a greater set of barriers to progression. The survey results show that for every 100 senior business directors, executives, and experts that assemble in our industry, there are 12 women missing from that group. And the way I think about this is if you were at a family wedding and everybody was sitting down to a lovely wedding breakfast waiting for the toasts, that 12 missing women is the equivalent of a table at the wedding that is empty. A whole part of the family that isn't there. The survey results show that only 1 in 4 respondents had a female line manager, and that had a material impact on women's access to training and development. And of course, what that means is subsequent opportunity for women. The survey also showed that 1 in 3 women do not think they have the flexibility to maintain a work-life balance. And of course, over time, what that will do is contribute to attrition rates of women in the industry. And the survey results show that even in those organisations with diversity and inclusion initiatives, 1 in 3 respondents did not know how to report issues related to gender. And that number rises to 2 in 3 when diversity and inclusion initiatives do not exist. Now, this is important. And the reason this is important is that many of those things associated with gender fall into the category of either duty of care to staff or statutory compliance. In other words, these aspects could be associated with a legal requirement on organisations. And if individuals within those organisations are not able or don't know how to report issues related to gender, that leaves organisations in our industry open to failures in statutory care. So that's the executive summary. So let's dig into that. Why did we say that? Why have we come to these conclusions? Well, let's start with, is the fibre industry a good place to work? We asked the question, would you recommend a career in the fibre industry? And the majority of respondents said yes, they could. They agreed they would recommend a career in the fibre industry. And whilst there were slightly fewer women than men who answered positive to that question, the difference wasn't of great significance. We asked the question, do you agree that you are able to be authentic to who you are at work? Now, in the survey, we defined being authentic to who you are as the ability to be honest about personal constraints that impact your work life, or having the confidence to voice concerns in the knowledge you will be treated fairly, openly, and in a respectful way. Again, the majority agreed. There were fewer women than men that agreed to that statement, but not significantly so. We asked the question, do you agree that everybody has the same opportunity to progress in your organisation? And the majority agreed that yes, everybody has the same opportunity to progress. But in this case, men were significantly more emphatic in that belief than women. In fact, there was a 17% difference in how many men agreed with that statement compared to women. So is the fibre industry a good place to work? I would say, based on these results, yes, it is. Most people would recommend a career. Most people were able to be authentic to themselves in the workplace. The majority feel that everybody has the same opportunities for progression. But for every 4 men who said that, only 3 women could say the same. And there's a significant minority of women who are not having the same positive experiences as their colleagues. So if there is some ambiguity as to whether everybody has the same opportunity to progress, then let's look at progression. Let's see if gender is a barrier to progression in the fibre industry. You'll remember that I showed the seniority levels that we have defined. And here on this graphic, you can see those seniority levels on the left-hand side. In the center of the graphic, in the blue circles, are the average distribution of seniority amongst all respondents, so not gendered in any way. And I've then pulled out of this graphic the percentage of men at those seniority levels and the percentage of women at those seniority levels, and then compared that to the average. What you can see is that women are overrepresented at the lower levels of seniority and underrepresented at the very highest levels. And sort of here in the middle, they are consistently underrepresented in these middle levels, if not at very great differences. Now, we went further than that and we started to look, okay, what about tenure? How does the amount of time you spent in the industry have an impact on this? So the graphic you see in front of you is for respondents who said they had a tenure of less than 10 years experience. Now, of course, not surprisingly, with less than 10 years experience, we have more, on average, more at these lower levels of seniority than right at the top. There's some consistency about the fact that women are underrepresented here in the middle, but the spread is so small. I look at this graph and say I can't see a gender bias here. That is to say, I cannot predict where you sit on the seniority rankings if you have a tenure of less than 10 years experience based only on your gender. In fact, at level 5, you can see here women with less than 10 years gender are actually overrepresented at this level 5 level compared to men. So I don't see a lot of gender bias here, apart from at this level 5, where you could actually say that women are advantaged. But the picture changes really significantly when we look at tenures of over 10 years. Here, The spread of distribution is much wider between men and women, suggesting a gender bias, and women are overrepresented at the lower levels of seniority and very significantly underrepresented at the highest levels of seniority. What it appears from this graph is not only does gender bias exist here, but also women appear to be awarded less for their long tenure. Just to interpret those results in another way, what those results are effectively saying is there are women that are missing in action in our industry. And they're not present in the numbers expected at senior levels in the industry. In our industry, for every 100 senior business directors and executives and experts that assemble, there are 12 women missing from that group. And you can see here from levels 3 to 6, there are women missing in action, whereas they are overrepresented at the lower levels. So we didn't just ask kind of yes or no or data-driven questions. We also had some questions in the survey that were open. We wanted people to give us their input. And one of the open questions we asked was, what barriers have you seen in your career to progression? Now, predominantly what men said was they had seen no barriers to their progression, whereas some women said they had seen no barriers to their progression, but a large number of women who responded said that they had seen gender bias. Motherhood, not surprisingly, was another barrier that they saw to progression. The dominance of male decision makers and the lack of access to male networks of influence were all things that women felt had been barriers to their progression. Now, because of this difference in experience, there were a small set of men who reject the lived experiences of their female colleagues entirely. And so we did see a number of responses along the lines of, I have not seen anyone experiencing barriers in his or her career because of his or her gender. There are no barriers of progression for anyone. One gentleman went as far as to say, I think this topic is total exaggerated nonsense. So whilst, and I think this is associated with the non-uniformity of experience. Not all women are experiencing barriers in their careers. Not all men are experiencing barriers in their career, but some women are experiencing gender bias, and the fact that the majority don't experience it does not mean it doesn't happen. So we also asked the question, do you have a female line manager? And 1 in 4 said yes. We said, have you received training in the past 12 months? And just over half said yes, they had received training in the past 12 months. And we correlated those two results. And what we discovered was that for those who had a female line manager, they were more likely than average to receive training. For those who had a male line manager, the men with a male line manager were about as likely as average to receive training. But women who had a male line manager were significantly less likely than their male colleagues to receive training, and significantly less likely than average, and certainly significantly less likely to receive training than if they had a female line manager. So gender, not only of the recipient of the training, but also of their line manager, has a material impact on whether women receive training, and that, of course, has a knock-on effect to opportunity. So in conclusion, gender is a barrier to progression. At senior levels, we have women who are missing in action. Most men experience no barriers to their progression, whilst women experience more and a broader set. And there are some men who reject the idea that barriers exist at all because they have not experienced those barriers. 1 in 4 had a female line manager, and for female respondents, that had a material impact on their access to training and development. As a result of that, the Women in Fibre Committee are offering 5 recommendations based on this data. Measure and track gender balance in senior leadership roles. If there is a great disparity there, do something about it. Measure and track gender balance in training. If there is a large disparity there, do something about it. Focus on progression for women towards senior leadership roles during mid-career, because mid-career appears to be the danger point for women. Create gender balance in leadership development pipelines and access for women to male networks of influence. Initiate unconscious bias training and opportunities for women to tell their stories in order to raise consciousness. Just because we have not all experienced gender bias does not mean it doesn't exist. Okay, next. Are diversity and inclusion initiatives working? Let's have a look at that. So we asked, are diversity initiatives in place in your organisation? And 3 out of 4 said yes. We also asked, do you know how to use your organisation diversity policies to report any issues you have associated with your gender? And for those who worked in organisations with diversity initiatives, at least 2 out of 3 said yes, they know how to report issues associated with gender. For those who work in organisations that don't have diversity initiatives, that proportion dropped dramatically. So now only around about 1 in 3 know how to report issues associated with gender. And that matters. That matters not just for duty of care, but because some of the issues that may be reported that are associated with gender are also associated with an organisation's statutory compliance. And so I think this one is something for managers to consider. Do your staff know how to report? It's really important they do. We also dug a bit deeper into diversity initiatives, and we got full text answers from a number of respondents. One gentleman said, what is not often considered in the gender debate is that male employees often have sisters and children, which they want to have the same chances in employment. And he liked the idea that his organisation were actively seeking for female candidates. If you feel the same, if you are a gentleman like this respondent here, stand up and be an ally. Where you see things where things can be improved, stand up and be an ally, because it is individual decisions made on a daily basis that will make a difference in moving the needle on some of the statistics that we've seen earlier. An alternative point of view is, one gentleman who said, to be honest, I've had quite enough of everything to do with diversity. One woman here says, I don't believe we need to do any more. I've never experienced any issues. Clearly, other women had experienced issues. One asked for gender pay gap reviews, have a policy to start with, more policies to refer to when people step over the line. Policies are good controls. It is in uncontrolled environments that a lot of this gender bias can really take root. So 3 in 4 respondents work for organisations that have diversity and inclusion initiatives. Great news. Having those diversity initiatives significantly increase awareness of diversity policies, and that's important because that means that organisations are complying with a duty of care to staff and statutory care. But even in organisations with diversity and inclusion initiatives, there are a significant number of people who do not know how to report. They need to be trained, because at the very worst point, that leaves organisations open to failures in statutory care. So, what are our recommendations based on this data? Initiate or perpetuate diversity and inclusion initiatives. Train staff on the use of diversity policies for issue reporting, and in delivering diversity and inclusion training, recognise that experiences are not uniform. Clearly, there are individuals in our industry who are really fed up of hearing about this topic and who potentially feel like it's a criticism of them. It is not a criticism of individuals. To say there is a gender bias is not to say that all men are biased, or to say there's a problem with the system is not to imply criticism of people within that system. It's a really important part of delivering diversity and inclusion is that we include everybody in the conversation. And just on behalf of the Women in Fibre Committee, I would like to say that our committee wants to include everybody in the conversation. We think that's important, and we hope that others within the industry think that's important too. Now let's turn to changes in work practices and flexibility. We asked, and of course we've been through a very extraordinary time recently, do you agree that changes in work practices during the COVID-19 pandemic have been an improvement in your work life? And the majority said yes. And interestingly enough, gender was not a predictor of that response. Men and women answered that question equally. The other thing that I looked at was, is that response correlated in some way with caring responsibilities? Because we did ask respondents if they had caring responsibilities, and in fact it's not. So neither gender nor caring responsibilities had an impact on that response. But what had a really big impact was age. Those dominant within the industry, that is those between 25 and 56, the majority of that Gen X and millennial generation liked the COVID-19 changes. The oldest and the youngest amongst the cohort were the least happy with those changes in work practices. We also asked, do you feel you're empowered to take flexible working opportunities in your organisation to maintain a work-life balance? And the majority said yes. Women were less likely to feel that way than men. There's about a 9% difference there in response. And of course, if respondents did not feel like they were empowered to maintain this work-life balance, that is going to have an impact on attrition rates, particularly over the long term. When I looked at tenure, we had a 50% difference between the women who have in our industry have a tenure of less than 5 years and women who have a tenure of more than 21 years. So most respondents agree that changes in work practices during COVID-19 have made an improvement in their work lives. That was not a gendered response. What that response correlated most closely to was age. The oldest and the youngest in the industry are least happy with the changes. The majority of respondents agreed that they had sufficient flexibility at work to maintain a work-life balance. This is really great news that the majority think that. Women were slightly less convinced, so 1 in 3 women don't feel like they have that flexibility. And over the long term, what that is going to inevitably do is increase attrition rates amongst women more than men. So in terms of recommendations based on that data, we would suggest that the work practices that have been put in place during the pandemic should be continued post-pandemic. But be aware that the youngest and oldest in the industry may prefer more traditional patterns of working or may need more support adapting to post-pandemic norms. Introduce or expand flexible working policies to allow staff to maintain a work-life balance and reduce attrition rates of women as tenure increases. So that's the data. I have kind of gone through all the recommendations, but I think it's worth just going through these again. Unless we measure and track something, we can't improve it. And we want to improve the balance of women in senior leadership roles. So measure and track that gender balance. And if you don't like the figures, do something about it. Measure and track gender balance in training. If you don't like those figures, do something about it. If you are a manager who has responsibility for staff, have a look at your own decision making. How many women are you putting through for training compared to the men in your teams? Is that proportion the same? If it's not, it should be. Focus on progression for women towards senior leadership roles during mid-career. There is a real danger point for women in the middle of their careers, and that has an effect later on. Create gender balance in leadership development pipelines so that we have a set of women who are being trained and given the opportunities to flex their managerial muscles so that they are ready to enter into those leadership pipelines and take those senior roles, and give access to women to those male networks of influence. Initiate unconscious bias trainings and opportunities for women to tell their stories in order to raise consciousness. It's easy to believe that simply because we have not experienced something that it doesn't exist. It does exist. Women feel it. They may not be the majority of women even, but if there is a significant minority of women who are not having a good time in our industry, we want to fix that. Initiate or perpetuate diversity and inclusion initiatives. That's important because it allows staff to understand what diversity policies are in place. Perhaps even more importantly than the initiatives themselves is to train staff on the use of diversity policies for issue reporting. Make that easy, because that is about a duty of care to staff and a statutory compliance for your organisation. In delivering diversity and inclusion training, recognise that experiences are not uniform and that improving a system does not imply criticism of individuals within the system. I'd like to speak directly to men who may be listening to this, who find the whole topic of diversity and inclusion uncomfortable. Discussion of diversity issues does not imply a direct criticism of men. I didn't become an engineer and go into one of the most male-dominated industries I could find because I didn't like men. I mean, you know, I have worked with some incredible men, men who are fair, who are smart, and who just want to get the job done. And I know that in dealing with a lot of, you know, women, including women in the Women in Fibre Committee, we're trying to make the system better. We're not implying criticism of individuals within that system. Continue COVID-19 work practices post-pandemic, but be aware that the youngest and the oldest in the industry may not like or may prefer more traditional patterns of working and need more support adapting to post-pandemic norms. And introduce or expand flexible working policies to allow staff to maintain that work-life balance and reduce attrition rates of women as tenure increases. And I'd like to leave you with this thought, which is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And that, in a sense, is the purpose of the survey, to try and look at the root causes of some of the gender disparity within our industry and find ways of improving it. So thank you very much. I'm going to pause there for questions.
Thank you very much, Rosh, for such an impassioned readout. I think I've heard that now four times maybe, and every time I hear it, I pick up more, and I can't help but being in awe of you know, how passionate you feel about this and the energy that you've put into this as a project. So a big thank you on behalf of the FTTH Council Europe for all of your hard work and the many hours that's gone into creating this great body of work. Lots of food for thought there, a huge amount of content, which, as I said earlier, will be made available to you once we've wrapped the webinar. So we do have a few minutes now left for some questions. I'm starting to see a few questions come in, but as I said earlier, don't be shy. We'd love to get some interaction with you via the Q&A. So Rosh, first question that's come in. What kinds of training exist to educate men on gender barriers in the industry?
That's a really good. That's a really good question. I've been fortunate to see a number of trainings now. So I think there is training from a lady who used to be at Facebook. I can't remember her name, but she wrote a book called Lean In. She has a company that runs gender bias training. There are other companies within Europe who specialise in this kind of unconscious bias training. So it is out there, and I think it is out there and it is available. But also, I would say one of the very best things you can do within your organisation is facilitate honest conversations with your female colleagues. They know. They definitely know where the issues are in your organisation, because they will have experienced it.
And I think as well on that point, Rosh, as we identified, a large number, a good percentage of 3 out of 4 people work for companies that have D&I initiatives within those companies, and quite often those forums are a great source of content and development tools that employees can leverage, both at an individual level but as a manager as well. So ways in which they can foster that more inclusive environment within their workplace. So again, if you're fortunate to work for one of those companies, then become a member, get involved. They are what you make of them. You get out of them what you put in.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I was just about to say yes, and we had a session in the Women in Fibre session at the Fibre to the Home conference, in which Tom Verbecki talked about male allies. If we're going to move the needle on this, we need to do this together. Clearly, I'm very passionate about this topic, but we need male allies. And so I would really encourage you to join those diversity and inclusion initiatives.
Indeed. Okay, we've got a few more questions, Rosh, so we'll work our way through those. We sometimes hear I guess comments like this, so let's take this one on, which is isn't the main reason women do not advance the same level as men it's because they choose to have children?
I think yes, that's a significant barrier. We saw that in the data, right? Motherhood was considered as a barrier to progression, and it seems to me this for millennia. In fact, it's just a fact of life. Women have the babies, right? We're the one who bear the children, and we're the ones who sustain the human race by bearing children, right? It's a necessary part of humanity to do that. But we don't lose our minds after having children. I mean, we are able to function and contribute after motherhood. So what are the barriers to us contributing after motherhood? Well, that's about work-life balance. It's about flexibility. It is clear that our industry is set up to advantage those that don't have children. And for a very long time, there was a sort of acceptance that that's just had to be the way you did it. That if you were in a sales organization, you had to be on the road 75% of your time. Well, we've just lived through a pandemic, and there are lots of sales organizations that are still selling, and their salespeople aren't away from home 75% of the time. There has been a assumption that if you lead a team, you have to be in the office in order to lead that team. Well, we've just been through a pandemic in which we weren't able to go into the office, and to my knowledge, teams are not disintegrating left, right, and centre simply because they meet on a video call instead of in the office. We can change things, and we should change things, because women do have children, and it's a good job they do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So let's just accept that fact, and accept the fact that our female talent is likely to get pregnant at some point, and adjust our organizations to cope with it, because it's a fact of life. I think that some of the decision making means that we perpetuate this lack of opportunity, lack of training for women in those mid-careers, because we think they're going to go off and have a baby, right? And that then has a knock-on effect later on. It is also the case that society is changing. There are women who don't have children, and there are women who don't want children. There are women who have partners that stay at home and look after their children. The world is a changing place, and we shouldn't make assumptions about the way women should or will behave simply based on their gender, any more than we should make assumptions about how men should or will behave based on their gender.
Great response. Thank you, Rosh. And you touched a little bit there in terms of the need for flexible working. And obviously, we've been through a couple of years where I think companies have adapted mindsets and you know, become more open to flexible and working from home provisions. We've had a question that's come in, which I'll read out now. It was mentioned that men and women equally prefer the flexibility the pandemic caused in working from home, etc. Do you have any insight or view on the leading reasons of men versus women, if there are any differences to why that statement applies?
Now that's a really good question. We did not ask an open question about that. So we asked the question, you know, do you like the working practices? But we didn't go deeper and ask why. I suspect we will be doing another one of these surveys at some point in the future, and maybe that's a lesson for us to go deeper into those questions so that I'm able to answer that. So the data doesn't tell us basically on why that is. I was not, if I'm honest, I wasn't surprised that it wasn't a gendered response, because I think that whether or not you're enjoying working from home with less time in the office probably has a lot more to do with your role, and also whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, which I think is a personality trait as opposed to a gendered trait. I think some people like the face-to-face, the energy they get from a face-to-face interaction, and some people find that exhausting, you know, and that's not a gendered thing, that's a personality type.
Yeah, and I guess how much other distractions that individual has in their home environment. I mean, you know, so many colleagues that have had to contend with, you know, raising small children, pets jumping on top of them, everything going on while they're still trying to maintain focus on conference calls as well. So challenging times. Okay, another question for you. From what I can see from the data, we've made some huge strides in the past 21 years. Doesn't this mean that things are finally getting better for women in the workplace?
Yeah, so we had some debate about this, and I think this is whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person. So I showed, can I just go back to these graphs if I can? Sorry, let me, because it's easier to show you. I do apologize if this is, here we go. Okay, so this graph, which is less than 10 years, and this one, which is more than 10 years. And there were those that looked at these graphs and said, well, that means that things are getting better. And there were those that looked at these graphs and said, aha, well, that just demonstrates there's a glass ceiling. The fact of the matter is, this data does not show either of those things. There isn't enough data here to make the leap that says that the fact that this is a lower gender bias than this means things are getting better. Nor is there a sufficient amount of data to say that this is evidence of a glass ceiling, you know, because at lower levels there is no gender bias, but at higher levels there clearly is. I was very, very disciplined about not going further than the data would allow me to go. And so the fact that you could take this data and explain it in two divergently different explanations demonstrates that you just can't go that far with this data.
Great, thank you, Rosh. We're getting some lovely comments in, by the way. So thank you everyone for your warm response there. Lots of thank yous, and some suggestions. So someone's talked about the lady, obviously, that you referenced was Cheryl Sandberg.
That's right.
They received the Lean In Netherlands 50 Ways to Fight Bias training via work, which they recommend for some training and development there. So thank you very much for that suggestion. Another question is, did we cut the data in any way by geography? So i.e., are there particular biases between countries?
We didn't cut it by geography. One of the reasons for that, was that we didn't have sufficient, well, first of all, we didn't ask the question, where are you located? And I think the reason we didn't ask that question was twofold, really. First of all, we were concerned about slicing the data into too many parts and not having a statistically significant set. We did ask about ethnicity, and perhaps something I should have said, really, is that in EMEA, our industry is so predominantly white that we could not slice this data by ethnicity because we simply didn't have a statistically strong set of any ethnicity that wasn't white, which is another, that's another aspect of diversity that that maybe the industry needs to think about.
And actually, someone's asked that question: is would we consider a next iteration of the survey where we would perhaps look at citizen status or race as an extension of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we would have done if we could. If I could have done, I would have done.
Yeah.
But I just didn't have enough respondents to be able to do it.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Just working our way through some of these questions. We're getting yes, people asking if we can download the data. Absolutely. This is all going to be available to you as a full set of material afterwards. So, to be able to use and take back to your companies. I think we've got time for one more question, Rosh. Did you find companies which have developed career paths specifically for women taking special care of elevating their children with reduced working hours and more flexible hours? That's talking about best practice, so identifying companies out there who are doing a really good job, and perhaps, which I think we're trying to do, is there are people that are really trying to address this gender balance, and how are they getting it right, and what lessons can we take from them and perhaps share with a wider audience?
So I think the person that asked that question has just added a task onto the Women in Fibre Committee task list. I think that's one of the things we want to do, and it's one of our stated aims, which is to share best practice. We didn't ask specific questions like that in the survey, mainly because we didn't want to identify organisations specifically. But you'll notice that a lot of this is, we're not calling out individual organisations or individuals at all, in fact. But when we share best practice, I think we will do that. And it is something that, we have, I know in Corning, we've spoken about this a lot, about the sort of the fast, slow, fast, which is the nature of a woman, particularly if you have children. Well, it's the nature of a mother's career, which is you can go fast in early career until you have a child, and then there's a period where maybe you've got to sort of level set. But when you're ready, then the next thing to do is to go fast again, and we need to be able to do that.
Indeed. Rosh, I think we could probably have gone for another 15, 20 minutes. We've still got questions in the queue to answer. So thank you so much for everyone for being so engaged and interactive. That really means a lot to us. So thank you for participation. Again, a huge thank you to Rosh. If you'd like to pick up the discussion with us and continue this, then we will be hosting a 3-hour workshop at the Fibre to the Home conference in Vienna in March next year. So what we'll be doing is a blend of keynotes, some panel sessions, and then some roundtables discussions as well. And so some of these key themes may well be tabled for discussion then, and we'd love to see you and get some input from you then. Thank you very much to our wonderful presenter, Roshene. Thank you all for attending. We wish you a very happy holidays, and we'll see you in 2022. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.